Maine, August 19th, Grafton Notch, Maine, south to Speck Pond Shelter. This will be a 6-night, 7-day backpacking trip from Maine to New Hampshire. We had left our car in Gorham, New Hampshire. We had given a ride to a thru hiker to the trail from Gorham, and he told us that he had done this section of the trail yesterday. He said that there was a dead moose in Mahoosic Notch. My sister and her family picked us up and drove us to the Grafton Notch parking lot in Maine. The day was sunny, windy, and cool. A beautiful day to start a backpacking trip. Last night, we had stayed in a motel with my family, and it was the coldest night of the summer. In the morning, I made a big breakfast, and we had leftover pancakes with us when we headed out. The trail started off immediately with a steep climb, and with full backpacks on it, made the climb up even more difficult, especially for me. The hike up had a lot of great views, and Dave was loving the mountain views. We started off in good spirits because there was a view around every turn in the trail. We kept climbing higher and higher, and the views were getting better with each climb. Many day hikers had passed us going up on the trails, and we saw more hikers that were hiking up and back to the fire tower, which was at the top of Old Speck Mountain. The top of Old Speck Mountain was off the AT, so we were not going to be going up to the fire tower. We had met another thru hiker heading north, and Dave had asked him about the dead moose that the hiker had told us about. He told us that the moose was still there and that it was getting very ripe. The trail had mostly climbed up with some short dips down. There was a lot of mica on the trail. It looks like gold. There was more mica here than we had ever seen on any other trail that we had hiked. We were happy when we reached the Elbow Trail, as we had done our first mile on the trail. Now it would be a long stretch to the next trail junction and then about a 1.1-mile hike to the campsite. We were getting excited that we would make it to the campsite. The trail reached a steep descent, and it was the hardest descent we had ever done. The wind was cold and blowing in this open rock area with only small scrub brush. It was like being above tree line in the sun. We thought that we would never reach the campsite before dark. It was a good thing we had got there when we did, because the site was almost full. There was a big youth group here, and they had taken up most of the tent platforms. Even the caretaker for the site was shocked that it was this full on a Sunday night. He told us that he was expecting a nice, relaxing night here tonight. It was the coldest night of the summer, and we were freezing as we were setting up for the night on the tent platform. I could hear a woman yelling to the caretaker that the rest of her party was having trouble making it to the campsite and that they might not make it because her husband was having knee problems. We saw a squirrel today, but did not see or hear any other wildlife today. The highlight was all the great views we had today. The low point was the last descent down to the campsite because it was very hard and we were very tired, and the campsite being full and the nervousness about tomorrow's hike through the Notch. It is said to be the hardest mile on the entire AT. August 20th, Speck Pond Shelter, south to Full Goose Shelter. The night was very rough. I did not sleep very much. I was freezing in my sleeping bag, and the inside of the tent was wet with dew and was dripping on us. We had tried to cover up with a tarp inside the tent, and even the tarp had dew under it, which just made the sleeping bags wet. When we woke up, it was still freezing out. Dave had to pee and had to go outside. He was not happy because it was so cold out there. I heard him say that the sun was up. However, inside the tent, it looked cloudy and cold. It was a beautiful day after we ate our breakfast. The campground at Speck Pond was hilly, but very beautiful inside a spruce pine forest. The campground was packed last night with a big youth group that left early in the morning. The caretaker told us last night that he had heard the youth group was not going to stop at the next shelter. We packed down and headed out onto the trail. The trail went around the pond. There was a breeze blowing across the pond, and it felt cold. The area had the most beautiful views of Mahoosic Mountain as we climbed up from Speck Pond. Magnificent. The alpine bog was fantastic, and we found some wild blueberries here that tasted great. However, there were not many berries left, as other hikers had already picked most of them. The hikers from the campsite that had trouble making it to the campsite last night were were behind us during the climb up. It was a family that we had heard that had planned to do the same section of the trail that we were doing. We heard that they had decided that the route was too hard and had planned to stay another night at Speck Pond campsite because they did not think that they could make it through the notch. We heard from the caretaker that they were going back out to the road the next morning, but wanted to see the notch. The loud woman that we had heard last night was hiking at the same pace as us with her friend and was talking very loudly behind us. Whenever we stopped to take a break, she would also take a break, so we could not outpace her, and she would not pass us. It would have been a nicer hike if she was just not talking constantly and so loud. We reached the descent down the arm, which is the hardest climb up from the notch. However, it will be the hardest descent for us. This section was not what we had pictured in our mind to be. We had thought that it would be an open area over a ledge down to the notch, similar to yesterday's climb down to the campsite, but it was not in an open area. It was in the woods, and it was very rocky with big boulders to climb over and between on a steep descent. It was very long and no open ledges. However, it did have large, flat, slanted boulders to slide down on. Dave had slipped a couple of times on the slanted boulders. There was very little to grab a hold of or to place your foot on going down the slanted boulder, so it is easy to slip on your way down. I think that it is more harder going down as it is climbing up the slanted boulders newly. We could still hear the women and her group still behind us in a distance, and we tried to move faster down to get away from them. When we reached the bottom, we crossed a small stream and then came out of the spruce forest and entered a hardwood forest. We stopped here and ate our lunch. Two of the girls from the group that was following us had sat down with us. They had no food and were running out of water. We could not fill up at the stream crossing as the water was too low for our pump and did not have enough water to share with them, as we did not know how far it was to the next water source. They said that they wanted to see the big rocks in the notch and asked us how much further it was from here. I told them that we did not know how far it was to the notch. We packed up and headed out, and one of the girls asked us to yell out when we reached the notch. About 10 minutes later, we reached a very large boulder and believed that we had finally reached the notch. I had thought at first that it was a very beautiful area. We entered the mile-long notch with the huge boulders that had fell from the top and had created a huge boulder pile that we needed to climb over between and under large caves, which were made out of the boulders. It would definitely be the longest and hardest mile of the trail that we had ever done, and it will live up to its reputation. The first cave tunnel was fun, as we had to actually squeeze down under a huge boulder and down into a cave under the boulder. We actually had to take off our backpacks in order to squeeze under the boulder and then drag the pack under the boulder and into the cave. Under another boulder cave, Dave had to pull me through the other side to help me get up onto a boulder at the end of the cave because the backpack kept pulling me back down into the cave. And there was a small crevasse that went deeper under my feet, and I was afraid that I might slip into it. In some areas, we had a hard time finding a white blaze. In one section, we went around a boulder and back in the same direction, around the same boulder. We had to look hard to find the blaze going south. I began to wonder how many hikers get lost in here. The further we got into the notch, the more confusing and difficult the trail got. It was easy to fall on these boulders, and a couple of times both me and Dave did. I had banged my knee on a boulder once when I fell one time, and another time my foot had got stuck in between two boulders as I was squeezing through them. A few times we had to take off our backpacks and go onto our stomach under a couple of boulders, then climb under the boulder, get onto our side, and drag our backpacks through it. We could smell the dead moose for about 0.2 of a mile before we saw it. It was awful. The smell was so bad we had to use our scarves to cover our nose and mouth. Even that wasn't enough. The moose had fallen down onto the trail and the notch. Someone had hung prey flags around the area where the carcass was, and a new path was made through some brush around it. They even X'd out the white blazes through this area. Dave went over to check it out. Not me. He told me after that only the bones and fur was left. However, it still smelled really, really bad. We were finally out. After what felt like an eternity, we were out of the notch. We were happy that we had done it and that we had finished it as it was its own adventure. We were tired and sore and ready to stop for the night, but we were low on water and did not have enough for the night to cook our meal. There was one campsite at the end of the notch that was on a blue blaze trail. However, it was only about 0.2 miles from where the dead moose was. So we decided that we did not want to camp here and smell the moose all night, so we pushed on up the next mountain. It was already around 7 when we began our climb up Fulling Mountain, and we were nicely surprised to see an owl in a tree. We were almost over the mountain when we saw it. I saw it fly across the trail, and it landed on top of a dead tree. It looked like a small barred owl, and it turned its head around and looked down on us. Dave was videoing the owl, and I was trying to get a picture of it. It was not close enough for the camera to get a nice picture, so I moved in closer to get a better shot, but he turned his head and looked down at me, then flew away. It was an awesome owl sighting, the best one that we have ever had. We reached the mountaintop at sunset in an alpine bog, and it was beautiful. I would have liked to stealth camp here, but there was nothing to hang our food bag up on, so we had to push on down the mountain as it was starting to get dark. We had reached Full Goose Shelter just in time. The tent site was full, there was no platforms that were open. The shelter still had some open space, and one of the tent platforms that had a tent on it was large enough for 2 tents to set. The area was full of thru hikers. As you know, I am not comfortable with setting up close to other hikers. I like my space. So we searched around, found a nice site in the pines below the privy. We had set up the tent, and I went to use the privy. It was dark, and I only had a pen light flashlight to make my way to the privy. The pen light kept going out, and Dave was worried that I would get lost in the dark, but I made it out and back okay. We could hear the other hikers, which was okay, but we are not used to being so close to other hikers. Thru hikers have months to get used to being around other hikers and begin to become a community. As section hikers, we are not out long enough to get used to being around other hikers. We can only hike short sections, and then we have to return home and back to our daily life again. It was another cold night, and I was cold during the entire night, especially my legs, and we were getting used to the condensation inside the tent. August 21st, Full Goose Shelter, south to Carlo Cove Shelter. I heard the sounds of a red squirrel, and Dave said that he had heard some kind of bird making a lot of noise at the crack of dawn. Somewhere around our tent, I did not hear it. We woke with the sun shining on our tent. It was a beautiful tent site, and so far we have had good weather on the trip. We packed down and headed out onto the trail. It was a steep climb up from the campsite, over hard boulder climbs and slanted ledge rocks. One even had a ladder made with the tree in the area to the north peak of Goose Eye Mountain. The views up here was spectacular, and it was a nice sunny warm day. We stopped to eat some blueberries on the ledge. We then went through a lot of mud bogs on the top of the peak. There was some boardwalks over the bog areas. They had done a lot of work on this section of the trail with the boardwalks and the ladders up the steep, slanted rock climbs. We had thought that today would be a nice, easy 4-mile hike after doing the notch yesterday, but no, it was not. It was very hard and slow going. I would have to say that this section of the trail was harder than when we did the Franconia Range last year. One of the rock climb was so hard that I had to take off my pack and push it up to Dave at the top of the rock so that I could use my hands and feet to climb up vertically straight up. The pack was just too heavy and had kept pulling me down. The downs was even worse as they were vertically down on the slanted rocks. Dave had actually slipped on one of them and had hit his knee at the bottom on a tree root. It was taking us all day to do a measly 4-mile day hike. The trail was beautiful, but we were still tired after doing the notch yesterday. Today, we were having a hard time enjoying the hike. My toes was starting to hurt from banging them into the front of my boots on the descents down. We were having a hard time trying to tell where we were on the AT map. There were so many PUDs that We just couldn't tell if we even made it to the top of Mount Carlo, but we finally discovered where we were. And in awe, we saw that we were only as far as the back of North Peak of Goose Eye, and we still needed to get to East Peak. And the terrain here was so difficult. We had passed a lot of through hikers going north, and one of them had told us that Mount Success, which we had planned for tomorrow, was going to be very hard with a hard rope climb. Later, another couple had told us they had to take off their packs in that area. We had thought that the notch was the worst area in this section of the trail, but today was just as hard. Now I was getting nervous about doing some kind of rock climbing up a steep ledge with a rope tomorrow. How bad is that going to be? Well, all that I can say right now is that at least the weather is great and that it has just been cold at night. We made it to the Carlo Cove campsites. However, it went steep down from the AT to the campsites, and it had no mileage marking how far it was to the campsites. We found a tent platform and set our tent. As we were eating our dinner, we saw a red squirrel running around, and then we saw a red mouse running out from under our platform that looked at us while we were cooking our dinner. Very strange. The wind had picked up and it started to get cooler. It would probably be another cold night in the tent. Dave had seen 2 red-tailed hawks flying over Goose Eye Mountain. He said it looked like they were mating. We had heard some crows and some heat crickets. The trail was mostly quiet today, and we did not see any other wildlife on the trail today. During the night, we could hear the mouse moving around on the platform. Good thing we're inside the tent and that it is outside of the tent. August 22nd, Carlo Cove Shelter, south to the New Hampshire border. We woke up early this morning, before 6 o'clock, to an animal running around the tent. I could see the shadow of a small animal running around the tent platform. I was not sure if it was just a squirrel. The sun was on the tent, and I thanked God that it looked like another nice day for hiking. We were so excited about crossing into New Hampshire today. We climbed back up from the campsite to the AT, and the trail started right off with a steep climb over huge boulders again. We had some distant views of the valley below during the climb. However, it was all in the morning fog, and now here we were. We knew that Mount Success was going to be a hard climb because some through hikers had told us about an interesting rock climb using a rope. We had reached the Maine and the New Hampshire border, another state line crossing.